The wind howled across the empty plains as rancher Jacob Carter rode back to his homestead, his heart heavy from another long day. Just as he reached his barn, a faint rustling in the bushes caught his attention. A small, trembling figure emerged, a starving native child, barely able to stand. Without hesitation, Jacob knelt down and offered the boy his last piece of bread. Little did he know, that single act of kindness would change his life forever. Jacob Carter had spent years working his land alone, ever since his wife passed. The townsfolk called him a quiet man, one who kept to himself but never turned away someone in need. That evening, as he carried the weak child into his home, he noticed the boy's sunken eyes and torn clothes. The child didn't speak, but his trembling hands clutched the bread like it was his last hope. Jacob warmed some stew and wrapped him in a blanket, wondering where he'd come from. As the fire crackled, the boy finally whispered a single word, Lakota. Jacob's breath caught. The Lakota tribe had been pushed further west, and tensions with settlers were high. He knew helping this boy could bring trouble, but turning him away wasn't an option. That night, as the boy slept, Jacob kept watch, his rifle leaning against the wall, just in case. The next morning, he stepped outside and froze. The horizon was no longer empty. Over 200 Lakota warriors stood in silence, their horses still, their faces unreadable. At the front was an elder, his eyes locked onto Jacob. The rancher's heart pounded. Had they come for revenge? Or something else entirely? The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt as Jacob stood motionless, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. The Lakota warriors didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. The elder at the front raised his hand slowly, palm open. A sign of peace? Or a warning? Jacob's throat went dry. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, and the small boy he'd saved stepped outside, still wrapped in the blanket. The moment the warriors saw him, a murmur spread through their ranks. The elder's stern expression softened. One of the younger warriors dismounted and walked forward, his eyes locked on the boy. Jacob braced himself, but the warrior simply knelt and spoke in a low voice. The boy's face lit up, and he replied in their tongue. Jacob couldn't understand the words, but the relief in the air was unmistakable. The elder nodded at Jacob, then turned and signaled to the others. To Jacob's shock, the warriors began unpacking bundles from their horses, food, furs, and even tools. The elder approached, his voice steady. "You saved my grandson," he said in broken English. "We do not forget kindness." Jacob could only stare as the Lakota began setting up camp near his barn, not as enemies, but as guests. The boy, now smiling, tugged at Jacob's sleeve and pointed to a woman in the group. "My mother," he said. Jacob's chest tightened. This wasn't just about gratitude, the boy had been lost, and his family had been searching for him. As the day wore on, Jacob learned more. The boy had wandered off during a harsh winter storm, and the tribe had scoured the land for days, fearing the worst. When they'd seen smoke from Jacob's chimney, they'd come prepared for a confrontation. But instead of hostility, they found their missing child safe, and a man who'd shown compassion despite the tensions between their peoples. That evening, as the Lakota shared a meal with him, Jacob noticed something odd. A group of warriors kept glancing toward the distant hills, their expressions tense. The elder noticed his curiosity and sighed. "There are others who do not share our peace," he admitted. "Men who hunt us. They follow." Jacob's stomach dropped. He'd heard rumors of rogue bounty hunters attacking native camps, but he'd never imagined they'd come this close. Just then, a scout rushed into the camp, speaking urgently. The elder's face darkened. He turned to Jacob. "They are here." The firelight flickered across the tense faces as Jacob absorbed the elder's words. The bounty hunters were coming, not just for the Lakota, but likely for anyone who stood with them. Jacob's mind raced. His ranch was isolated, no one would hear gunfire for miles. The warriors moved with quiet efficiency, extinguishing fires and gathering weapons. The boy, Little Hawk, as Jacob now knew him, clutched his mother's hand, his eyes wide with fear. Jacob made a decision. "There's an old mining tunnel behind the barn," he said quickly. "It's hidden. The women and children can take shelter there." The elder studied him for a long moment before nodding. As the women and children hurried to safety, Jacob and the warriors prepared. The Lakota moved like shadows in the moonlight, taking positions around the perimeter. Jacob grabbed his rifle and a spare revolver, his hands steady despite the pounding in his chest. He'd never fought alongside natives before, never imagined he would. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just yesterday, he'd been a solitary rancher, now he was preparing for battle with people he'd been taught to fear. The first sign of trouble came when the dogs started barking. Then silence. Too much silence. Jacob crouched behind a water trough, his breath fogging in the cold air. A twig snapped. Then another. Shadows moved at the tree line, at least a dozen men, maybe more. They fanned out, surrounding the property. Jacob recognized their leader, Bill Rourke, a notorious hunter who'd bragged in town about his Indian scalps. The man moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. Suddenly, a war cry split the night air. Arrows whistled from the darkness, finding their marks. Chaos erupted as the bounty hunters returned fire. Jacob squeezed off 2 shots, seeing a man drop. The Lakota warriors moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing in the smoke and shadows. Rourke bellowed orders, his voice thick with rage. "Burn them out," he shouted. Jacob's blood ran cold as he saw the torches being lit. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, a new sound emerged, hoofbeats, dozens of them. Through the smoke rode a group of unexpected allies, the town marshal and a dozen armed ranchers. They'd seen the smoke and come to investigate. The tide turned instantly. Caught between the Lakota and the townsmen, the bounty hunters broke ranks. Some fell where they stood, others fled into the night. Rourke himself took a bullet to the leg before being dragged away by his men. As dawn broke, the full story emerged. The marshal admitted he'd been tracking Rourke's gang for weeks. "Didn't expect to find you making friends with the Lakota, Carter," he said, eyeing the warriors warily. The elder stepped forward. "Your people and mine have fought for generations," he said to the marshal. "But today, we fought together." The marshal hesitated, then extended his hand. But the celebration was cut short when a young warrior came running from the barn. His panicked words sent a chill through everyone. Little Hawk and 2 other children were missing. The tracks led east, toward the river. And the bounty hunters had gone that way too. The moment the missing children were discovered, a terrible silence fell over the group. Jacob saw Little Hawk's mother collapse to her knees, her wail of anguish cutting through the morning air. The elder's face turned to stone as he examined the tracks, 3 small sets of footprints dragged alongside boot marks, then the clear imprint of a body being carried. Rourke had taken hostages. Jacob's hands clenched into fists as he studied the trail leading toward the treacherous Red Canyon, where the river cut through sheer cliffs. That was no accident. Rourke knew the terrain, knew the Lakota would hesitate to follow there. The canyon was sacred ground, forbidden to outsiders, but more importantly, it was a death trap for anyone unfamiliar with its twisting passages. Without a word, Jacob began saddling his fastest horse. The marshal grabbed his arm. "You ain't thinking straight, Carter. That's suicide country up there." Jacob shook him off. "They've got a 5-year-old boy," he said through gritted teeth. Behind him, the Lakota warriors were already mounting up, their faces set in grim determination. The elder approached, his eyes boring into Jacob's. "You do not know our ways," he said. "But you have the heart of a warrior. Ride with us." The marshal exhaled sharply, then turned to his men. "Well, we gonna let these Indians show us up?" To Jacob's surprise, half the townsmen chose to join the pursuit. The posse rode hard, following the trail of broken branches and occasional scraps of cloth the children had left behind. Jacob noticed something odd. Every so often, there'd be a small pile of stones arranged in a particular way. The warriors nodded approvingly when they saw them. "Little Hawk is clever," one said. "He marks the path." The boy was leaving a trail for them to follow. Jacob's chest swelled with pride even as his gut twisted with fear for the child. As they neared the canyon rim, the terrain turned brutal. Jagged rocks tore at the horse's legs, and the path narrowed to a treacherous ledge. Suddenly, a shot rang out, kicking up dust near Jacob's boot. Rourke's men were waiting in the rocks above. The marshal's hat went flying as another bullet whizzed by. "Ambush!" someone shouted. The Lakota warriors reacted instantly, some dismounting to scale the cliffs like mountain goats while others provided covering fire with their bows. Jacob and the townsmen took up positions behind boulders, returning fire. The echoing gunshot sounded like thunder in the confined space. During a lull in the shooting, Jacob caught movement further up the canyon, a flash of small hands waving between the rocks. The children were alive. But his momentary relief turned to horror as he saw their precarious position. They were perched on a narrow outcropping above the raging river, guarded by two of Rourke's men. Even worse, one of the bounty hunters was setting up something near the cliff edge, dynamite. The bastard meant to bring down the canyon wall on top of them all. Just then, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the canyon as one of the Lakota warriors dropped onto the dynamite man from above, tackling him before he could light the fuse. The struggle sent both men perilously close to the cliff's edge. Jacob recognized the warrior. It was Little Hawk's uncle, the one who'd first approached him at the ranch. With a final desperate lunge, the warrior shoved the bounty hunter over the edge, but couldn't stop his own momentum. Time seemed to freeze as the warrior teetered on the canyon's edge, his arms windmilling desperately. Jacob didn't think, he moved. Scrambling over sharp rocks, he lunged forward just as the man started to fall. His fingers closed around the warrior's wrist with a grip born of pure adrenaline. The sudden weight nearly pulled Jacob over too, until strong hands grabbed his belt from behind, the marshal and two Lakota warriors anchoring them both. With a grunting heave, they hauled the men back to safety. The rescued warrior gasped in Jacob's face, his eyes wide with something beyond gratitude, a recognition that this white man had just crossed an invisible line that few ever did. There was no time for words. Another gunshot cracked against the rocks above them, sending stone chips flying. Rourke wasn't finished. The dynamite had rolled dangerously close to the edge during the struggle. One of the Lakota warriors, a youth no older than 16, scrambled to grab it, his hands shaking as he carefully disabled the fuse. The marshal wiped sweat from his brow. "That damn fool Rourke's crazier than I thought," he muttered. Jacob's eyes darted back to where he'd seen the children. They were gone. His heart stopped until he spotted fresh scuff marks leading up a narrow goat path. Rourke was moving them higher, toward the canyon's most treacherous point, Dead Man's Perch, where the river narrowed into violent rapids below. The bastard was herding them toward a place with no escape. The group split up silently, using hand signals the Lakota warriors taught in hurried gestures. Some scaled the cliffs to flank Rourke's position while others, including Jacob, took the direct path, using gunfire to keep the bounty hunters distracted. The canyon walls amplified every sound, the metallic ping of bullets ricocheting off stone, the panicked whinnies of horses, and once, horrifyingly, a child's sob that echoed through the ravine. Jacob's vision tunneled. He stopped noticing the blood from his scraped hands or the burning in his lungs. There was only the next boulder to take cover behind, the next few feet to gain toward those trapped children. They found Rourke at last in a shallow cave just below the perch, his remaining 4 men forming a half-circle around the huddled children. The bounty hunter had a knife at Little Hawk's throat, the blade glinting wickedly in the sunlight. "One more step and the brat goes over." Rourke screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. The children were crying silently, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Jacob noticed Little Hawk wasn't crying, the boy's jaw was set, his small hands clenched at his sides. Then Jacob saw why. The child held a sharp stone hidden against his palm, waiting for his moment. The warrior blood ran strong in him. A strange calm settled over Jacob. He lowered his rifle slowly, meeting Rourke's wild eyes. "You don't want to do this, Bill," he said, his voice steady despite the thunder of his heartbeat. "That boy's worth 10 of you." Rourke's knife hand trembled. Jacob saw the exact moment the man realized there was no way out. His eyes darted to the raging river below, then back to the armed men surrounding him. Something snapped in Rourke's expression. With a sudden, violent motion, he shoved Little Hawk toward the cliff edge and turned to run. 3 things happened simultaneously. Little Hawk twisted like an eel, slashing Rourke's arm with his stone as he fell. Jacob dove forward, his fingers brushing the boy's shirt, and from above, a single arrow hissed through the air, finding its mark in Rourke's thigh. The bounty hunter screamed, stumbling backward, directly into the path of his own panicked horse. The animal reared, its hooves striking Rourke square in the chest, sending him over the precipice. His scream echoed terribly before being swallowed by the rapids below. In the stunned silence that followed, Jacob realized 2 things. He had Little Hawk safely in his arms, and the remaining bounty hunters were surrendering, their weapons clattering to the ground. The marshal moved to secure them, but Jacob's attention was on the boy clinging to him, shaking like a leaf now that his bravery wasn't needed anymore. "It's over," Jacob murmured. But as he looked up at the solemn faces of the Lakota warriors, he knew with cold certainty that it wasn't. The canyon walls seemed to whisper it, this was just the beginning. Because now they had to get everyone down alive, and the storm clouds gathering overhead promised fresh hell. Worse yet, one of the captive bounty hunters was grinning like he knew a secret. The first fat raindrops hit like gunshots as they hurried the children down from Dead Man's Perch. What had been a difficult climb up became a nightmare descent, the rocks turning slick, the narrow paths becoming treacherous mudslides. Jacob carried Little Hawk piggyback while the boy's mother guided the other 2 children, their small hands clutching hers like lifelines. The Lakota warriors moved with practiced ease, but even they slowed their pace, knowing one misstep could send someone tumbling into the now swollen river below. The marshal and his men brought up the rear, keeping wary eyes on their prisoners, especially the smirking bounty hunter whose grin hadn't faded even after Rourke's death. Halfway down, the storm unleashed its full fury. Rain came in sideways sheets, turning the canyon into a roaring waterslide. A deafening crack split the air as lightning struck the canyon rim, sending boulders crashing down the opposite wall. The group pressed flat against the rock face, shielding the children with their bodies as debris rained around them. In that chaotic moment, the grinning bounty hunter made his move. He shoved one of the townsmen into the marshal and bolted up the collapsing trail like a mountain goat. 2 Lakota warriors gave chase but slipped on the wet stones, barely catching themselves before sliding over the edge. The escape vanished into the storm, his laughter echoing weirdly through the canyon before being swallowed by the wind. They found temporary shelter in a shallow cave as darkness fell prematurely, the storm turning day into night. The remaining prisoners huddled together, their cockiness gone now that Rourke was dead and their leader had abandoned them. Jacob built a small fire while the warriors kept watch at the entrance. Little Hawk sat close to Jacob, his small hands warming by the flames. "He will bring more men," the boy said quietly in his halting English. Jacob didn't need to ask who he meant, the escaped bounty hunters. Grin had promised violence. The elder nodded grimly. "We must reach the valley by dawn," he said. "There, we can defend." The marshal rubbed his tired eyes. "Defend against what? How many more of these bastards are out there?" One of the prisoners finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "Rourke was small time. The man who got away, that's Hank Dobbs. He rides with the Grayson brothers." Even in the dim firelight, Jacob saw the color drain from the marshal's face. The Graysons were legendary outlaws, a gang of 20 ruthless men who controlled the territory west of the mountains. If they were coming, no makeshift alliance between townsfolk and Lakota would stand a chance. As if summoned by the thought, a new sound cut through the storm, not thunder, but distant war whoops and gunfire from the direction of Jacob's ranch. The elder stood abruptly, his face carved from stone. "They attack our women and children," he said. The unspoken truth hung heavy, the mining tunnel hideout had been discovered. Jacob's gut twisted. His ranch hands, two elderly cowboys who couldn't shoot straight, were all that stood between the attackers and the vulnerable. Little Hawk's mother suddenly gasped, her hands flying to her belly. Jacob hadn't noticed before, she was heavily pregnant. Now, her breath came in short pants as pain contorted her features. The other Lakota women rushed to her side, speaking rapidly in their tongue. The elder's jaw tightened. "The baby comes," he translated. "Too soon." The storm, the approaching outlaws, the labor, it was too much. Jacob met the marshal's eyes across the fire. Without a word, they reached the same decision. Someone had to get help. Jacob stood, shrugging into his still wet coat. "I'll go," he said. The elder gripped his arm. "Alone, you will die." Jacob nodded toward the prisoners. "They know these lands. One of them guides me." The captured men recoiled, but the marshal cocked his pistol meaningfully. "You heard the man. Who wants to earn some goodwill?" The youngest prisoner, a pockmarked kid no older than 18, swallowed hard. I know a shortcut. If we ride through the night." As Jacob prepared to leave, Little Hawk pressed something into his hand, a small leather pouch. "For protection," the boy whispered. Inside was a single eagle feather and a smooth river stone. Jacob tucked it inside his shirt, against his heart. The last thing he saw before vanishing into the storm was the pregnant woman's pained face and the warriors forming a protective circle around the cave mouth, their silhouettes backlit by lightning like ancient guardians. Somewhere out there, an outlaw gang was closing in, a traitor was leading them, and Jacob's only ally was a scared kid who might stab him in the back at first opportunity. The rain tasted like blood on his lips as he spurred his horse into the darkness. The storm raged like a living beast as Jacob and the young outlaw, Billy, pushed their horses through the mud-choked trails. Lightning flashed, illuminating the panic in Billy's eyes. "We ain't gonna make it," he shouted over the wind. Jacob leaned close, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You chose this when you rode with Rourke." Billy's face twisted, not with anger, but shame. "I never signed up for huntin' kids," he muttered. The word struck Jacob. This wasn't just some hardened criminal, he was a desperate kid who'd made bad choices. Their shortcut led them through a narrow pass where the wind howled like lost souls. Suddenly, Billy's horse reared with a shrill whinny, a fallen tree blocked their path, its branches moving unnaturally. Not a tree, a cleverly laid ambush. Shadows detached from the rocks. The Grayson gang. Jacob's hand flew to his revolver, but their leader, a bear of a man with a silver-plated pistol, laughed. "Well, if it ain't the do-gooder rancher." Then his eyes landed on Billy. "And our little turncoat." Billy surprised everyone. In one fluid motion, he drew and fired, hitting the silver pistol clean out of Grayson's hand. "I ain't yours no more," he yelled. The gang froze, stunned by the betrayal. Jacob seized the moment, firing warning shots that sent the outlaws scrambling for cover. As they retreated into the storm, Grayson's voice carried back, "This ain't over." Dawn found them at the ranch, where an impossible sight awaited, the Lakota women and children safe, guarded by a dozen armed townspeople led by Jacob's elderly ranch hands. The old cowboys stood tall, rifles steady. "We heard the fightin'," one explained. "Figured you'd need backup." The pregnant woman had delivered safely, a girl, wrapped in a blue trade blanket. The elder placed the newborn in Jacob's arms. "You ride as one of us now," he said simply. As the rising sun painted the canyon gold, Billy stood apart, staring at his hands. Jacob approached. "You saved lives today." Billy shook his head. Don't make up for what I done. Jacob pointed to the baby. That's what matters now, what you do next. Moral lesson: true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to do right despite it. One act of kindness can ripple outward, changing lives in ways we never foresee. Epilogue. Years later, a weathered sign hung over the ranch gate, Carter Little Hawk Homestead. The once divided valley now thrived, its children, White, Lakota, and those like little Billy who'd found redemption, playing together in the fields. And on quiet evenings, you could still see an old rancher and a Lakota elder sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, their laughter carrying on the wind.